Today I will tell you what I think about the M1 iMac. To give the whole thing a bit more structure and not to make a boring review here, I will tell you 5 specific things I like about the new iMac and 5 things I don't like so much about it. I will put the things I like the most and the things I like the least at the end of the list. So let's get started. Let's start with the design. In this regard, I would like to mention my first negative point and my first positive point. Design, of course, has a lot to do with personal taste. Therefore, everything I say in this context is of course very subjective. Apple has based the new M1 iMac on the first iMac from 1998 in many ways. The vibrant colors and overall design language make this new iMac much more of a lifestyle product than the iMac was before. If you take a look at Apple's commercials, this impression is reinforced once again. You see mainly very young people, partly children, or even people in a stylish and colorful environment. The iMac is used here in the living room or even in the kitchen. That's basically not a bad thing. However, the new iMac is positioned rather less as a classic working machine for professionals. This is all reflected in the design and, as we will see later, also in the specs. Of course, you can combine both worlds. Personally, however, I would have preferred a more classic design. As you can see, I chose silver, the only traditional color. I'm also not entirely happy with the white edges, although these may not fit badly with the colors. In combination with silver, the contrast is somewhat lacking. The Apple logo on the back now looks much more inconspicuous. The chin could have been a bit smaller as well. I am aware that all important hardware components are located in the chin. Still, a design similar to the Pro Display XDR would have been more to my liking, even if that might have meant making the iMac a bit thicker. But there is also a lot that I like about the design. I've been using an iMac for many years, and this new design looks incredibly compact in comparison. Even if I don't find everything perfect about it, it is of course a step forward compared to the old iMac. The edges and the chin are also much smaller than on the predecessor. Especially from the side, the new iMac looks incredibly thin and very stylishly designed. The design is much more angular than the one of the predecessor, which fits very well with this thin form. The angular design can also be seen when looking at the stand, for example. The design of the Magic Keyboard has also been revised. Overall, I like the new iMac. Especially the thin form factor is just fantastic. Let's talk about the configuration. As far as the specs of the new iMac are concerned, I'm not entirely happy with Apple's strategy. Apple sells the base model with only 2 USB 4 Thunderbolt ports, the 7-core GPU, no Magic Keyboard with Touch ID, and no Ethernet port. If you want 2 more USB 3 ports, the 8-core GPU, Touch ID, and the Ethernet port, you already have to pay a significant surcharge. I think that this upgraded model should have been the base model. It may be that less demanding users will be quite satisfied with the base model, but especially the 4 ports and Touch ID should actually be part of the base model standard features. And in this regard, I would like to mention my next positive aspect, the keyboard with Touch ID. Finally, Touch ID is also available on the iMac. It's really convenient to log in with Touch ID. I think it's been available on the MacBook Pro since 2016. Yes, I realize that it shouldn't be a problem to type in your password every now and then. But sometimes it's just the little things that make you happy. I already criticized the configuration of the base model earlier. In fact, I have another much more important complaint. The new iMac comes without an SD card slot. This makes it the first iMac in many years to come without an SD card reader. In fact, the target group that Apple wants to reach with the new Mac will still use SD cards very often. I myself use them almost daily, and the SD card slot on my old iMac was constantly occupied. I can't judge whether the thin form factor is actually a hindrance here. However, I don't think it is. The whole thing is even more surprising when you consider that rumors suggest that the next M1 MacBook Pro will again have an SD card slot. But of course, these are just rumors. The lack of an SD card slot probably means that now most iMac users will have to rely on a hub or at least an adapter. I have to admit that I also used the hub on my old iMac. However, it does not have an SD card slot. Despite the surcharge for the more expensive model, I was forced to buy another hub or at least another adapter. Here, I really have a hard time understanding Apple. Apart from the missing ports, you get a complete package with the new iMac that hardly leaves anything to be desired. You get a very powerful computer with which you can actually manage any kind of task. You get a large display that is also large enough to comfortably edit videos or perform other graphical tasks. You get a good keyboard and a very interesting mouse. Of course, you're already familiar with all of this if you ever used an iMac before. But that fact that you get everything in one package and in a very powerful form too remains for me one of the iMac's greatest strengths. I think the package has gotten even better. The speakers have been improved and sound simply excellent for integrated speakers. The webcam has actually also been improved and really delivers a good image. What I'm saying is that you really get everything you need in one package, and that remains a big plus of the iMac. Hopefully it stays that way for a long time, that the new iMac delivers everything you need, because it probably can't be upgraded once you've purchased it. And that's a significant drawback for a desktop computer. Even in the upgraded version, the iMac comes with 8GB of RAM and only 256GB of storage space. You can upgrade the memory to 16GB and SSD to up to 2TB. And you can imagine that you will pay a lot for each upgrade. Right now, it looks like the 16GB of RAM won't bring much benefit, but you can't know how long that will be. 256GB of storage space may be enough for most programs. But of course, it's not enough to store a lot of data like photos or videos. All this would basically not be a problem if you could upgrade later on. As I said though, it doesn't look like at the moment that this will ever be possible, at least officially. And that's despite reports that it would seem to be technically possible. Therefore, you have to carefully consider how much RAM and storage you need and might ever need when buying. For a desktop computer, this is a clear disadvantage. So let's get back to the positive things. And here I would like to mention the display. Maybe I am just used to much worse. In fact, my old iMac still had a poor Full HD display. Regardless, I have to say that the display is simply fantastic. It produces beautiful colors, has a resolution of 4.5K, and unlike the last 21-inch iMac, it also features Apple's True Tone technology. This means that the display detects the ambient light and adjusts the white balance and the brightness accordingly. This is supposed to make the image look more natural overall. Regardless of this technical explanation, I can simply tell you subjectively that the display delivers very nice images. Just for the sake of completeness, I have to add that the display does not feature the nano texture finish that Apple uses in the Pro Display XDR. This nano texture finish is supposed to reduce glare and reflections even more. Here behind the monitor is a window in my office. Still, I can't say that reflections have bothered me so far. But then of course, it depends on the situation whether you absolutely want a matte display. Before we get to my biggest criticism and also my biggest highlight, I would like to mention a few additional things that I noticed but which did not make it into the top 5. First of all, there is the price. Overall, I think the price is absolutely fine for what you get. For example, the M1 Mac Mini is always presented as a bargain, of course only within the Mac world. But if you want to buy a comparable high quality 4K monitor for it, then you won't be much better off price-wise. By the way, you can find links to current offers for the M1 iMac with different configurations in the video description. What I like less are the prices for the upgrades. $200 for 8GB of RAM or 256GB of storage space is just a lot. Unfortunately, we have been used to these prices for upgrades from Apple for quite some time. On the positive side, most of the programs work without any problems despite the new chip, and I have hardly had any complaints in this regard. Unfortunately, Apple still hasn't managed to make the iMac height adjustable. Personally, that doesn't bother me much, but it might be different for you. So let's get to my main criticism and my main strength of the new iMac. My biggest disappointment with the M1 iMac is actually a rather theoretical point, namely that Apple has used the same entry-level M1 chip that is used in the smallest MacBook Air. Basically, the 24 M1 iMac is a MacBook Air with a large display. I would have just liked to see Apple continue to treat the iMac as a proper desktop computer that also appeals to power users and therefore give it hardware that stands out from the smallest MacBook. The M2 processor will come, and if you believe the rumors, it will even come very soon. However, since I don't want to buy a new device every year, it would have simply been more future-proof if Apple had already used the next generation chip here. As I said, this disappointed me quite a bit, even if this aspect is absolutely purely theoretical for the moment. Because the M1 iMac delivers absolutely enough power. And that brings us to the absolute highlight of the new iMac. The performance is absolutely great. Everything runs exactly as it should. I think you've heard that several times now, but you have to try it out for yourself to really believe it. The new M1 chip is simply amazing, especially if you mainly use Apple software and edit your videos in Final Cut, for example. Yes, I know it is of course contradictory to first whine about a seemingly old chip and then praise the performance of the same chip, but I think you get my point. As much as I'm excited about the performance, I will still be a bit disappointed when the next, possibly much more powerful chip is introduced in a few months. In summary though, I can say that you're definitely not doing anything wrong by getting the new iMac. There are a few minor criticisms, but as you've seen, they're based more on Apple's strategic decisions and you might see things differently than I do. Just write in the comments if you want to know anything else about the new iMac, or what you think is good or maybe not so good. There will be more videos about the new iMac, so stay tuned and see you next time.